in 2008. I was in third grade. I don't really know what American politics was like before that. I was busy at the time with the whole not being born yet and then briefly being illiterate. So the mock 2008 election held at my elementary school was my first small introduction into the American political landscape. Which means I grew up watching patriotic, Christian, conservative, white politicians call this man slurs. You'd need a degree in data engineering just to interact with like a complete list of them all, but the real popular ones were that he was born in Kenya and forged his birth certificate, and that he was secretly a Muslim, and by extension that he hated America and was working towards its destruction. Politicians said these things knowing that they weren't true. I'm 25 years old. I have never seen good faith in American politics. So when, in 2016, Spraytan Satan, ran on his classic "I'm a bigot just like you" platform, although I wasn't willing to believe that he could win the popular vote, I mean, he didn't, I wasn't exactly flabbergasted at the behavior. If you're at all surprised by anything that's happened since 2016, you haven't really been paying attention. So, to those of you who don't quite understand, from those of us who told you so, I mentioned this book already in episode 0. Don't worry, you don't have to watch it. The book describes a framework for understanding how power structures function that's going to be helpful in contextualizing some of the events taking place today. Power structures are a wrapping around control over resources in as abstract a way as you can choose to imagine the word resource, but for our purposes, think of it as the economic output of a nation that its government has control over. The leader is the decision maker on how the resources are leveraged. The coalition are those required to gain or maintain control over the resources. Broadly speaking, the leader leverages the resources to meet the needs of the coalition, who then do the same thing as the pattern propagates to the very bottom of the power structure. The larger the coalition, the more difficult that becomes, and the shorter on average a rule, because if the leader fails to keep the coalition happy, they exercise their collective power to replace them. So, following that logic, a smart leader would attempt to manipulate the coalition by reducing its size and making its individual members as disposable as possible, and by doing so make their position more secure, and possibly extend their rule. Dictatorships feature small coalitions where control over the nation's wealth requires very few. Think like where some one industry, digging, drilling, mining, making, growing, some one thing, dominates the nation's economy, and where for that dominant industry, labor is often either cheaply outsourced or forced. Democracy is a form of governance that attempts to intentionally expand the size of the coalition. The exact details aren't super important. What makes democracy the best option is the expansion of the coalition. If the leader of a nation has to keep most of the citizens in the nation happy in order to gain or remain in power, they either will or someone else will. So, what determines the stability of a democracy? Democracies only function long term. They're only stable if the population is truly in control over the resources. In diverse economies where the wealth of the nation is the accumulated effort of its population, because then efforts to subvert the democratic process can be discouraged by withholding labor. Anyway, that's just the prerequisite conditions from which functional democracy emerges. In order to maintain that control, there can't be privileged classes in society given different levels of access to the political system. Basically, any member of the electorate should not just be eligible to run, but in practice actually capable of winning a campaign based on merit. Equity amongst its citizens is a fundamental pillar of democracy. Citizens also need access to education and information in order to make informed decisions. And in order to support policy or run an effective campaign, to have any influence over governance at all, citizens need the right to assemble, travel, form associations, free speech, and most especially speech to criticize the government or petition for change. Because, how could an opposition candidate run against an incumbent without being legally empowered to criticize them? Donald Trump's presidency has raised a question that many of us never thought we'd be asking. Is our democracy in danger? Harvard professors Stephen Levitsky and Daniel Ziblatt, I hope I pronounced that right, I'm not totally sure, have spent more than 20 years studying the breakdown of democracies in Europe and Latin America, and they believe the answer is yes. Democracy no longer ends with a bang in a revolution or a military coup, but with a whimper. The slow, steady weakening of critical institutions such as the judiciary and the press, and the gradual erosion of long-standing political norms. Drawing on decades of research in a wide range of historical and global examples from 1930s Europe to contemporary Hungary, Turkey, and Venezuela to the American South during Jim Crow, Levitsky and Zablat show how democracies die and how ours can be saved. Control over resources is the economic conditions that spawn democratic governments, and empowerment of the electorate enables that control to be maintained. How Democracies Die offers insights into how the actual mechanics inside a functioning democracy are kept healthy. Mutual toleration is recognizing and respecting the legitimacy of political opposition. Forbearance is exercising restraint when given power in governance to not use that power to the letter extent that the law allows, most especially against political opposition. The deeper conclusion is that representative bodies and democracies run on good faith. The system is supposed to be a competition of ideas, but ultimately in service of the same goals, the betterment of the nation. When politicians stop seeing the goal of politics as bettering the nation, and instead see the political landscape as a game for them to win, they'll inevitably start attacking the principles that enable the electorate to maintain control over the elected. They'll prioritize privileged groups, attack public education, spread misinformation, leverage the power of the state against those who criticize them, and undermine the right to vote. They'll embrace authoritarianism, control over resources, empowerment of the electorate, and good faith. Without control over the resources, the electorate has no means of preventing subversions of the democratic process. Without empowerment via equality, access, and rights, the electorate loses control over the resources. And without good faith in politics, politicians attack that empowerment. Take away any of those three things, and you have a dinosaur. Democracy in name only. Soar. Dinosaurs are dangerous. Even if you manage to keep it contained for the time being, eventually, it's getting out of that fucking cage. And then it's going to eat your face. So, authoritarianism is the tendency towards centralization of power. How Democracies Die offers 4 indicators of authoritarian behavior: rejection of democratic norms, denial of the legitimacy of political opponents, toleration or encouragement of violence, and readiness to curtail the civil liberties of political opponents. All 4 of which Donald Trump has done in the past 24 hours. It's a litmus test, not diagnostic, but if a politician shows any of these behaviors, they're dangerous to democracy. Authoritarians attempt to centralize power by dismantling opposition parties and the legal mechanisms that protect their existence, and then expanding the authority of the state. And they do this by employing rhetoric and propaganda engineered to evoke a strong emotional response, which circumvents critical thinking. Authoritarian leaders often know that the things that they're saying aren't true. The mentality of authoritarian leaders is often wildly different from that they impose on their followers. Authoritarian leaders, when confronted with authority, do not respond favorably. Where, on the other hand, people who respond positively to the rhetoric of authoritarians are often looking for strong authority figures in order to make sense of the patterns of thought that authoritarians take advantage of. I'm gonna have to be a little mean. Right-wing ideology is belief in social hierarchy, where society is naturally divided into groups based most often on immutable characteristics, and where those groups play distinct roles in society, and by extension their members enjoy different levels of privilege in society. Seeing the world this way tends to involve multiple hierarchies, like patriarchy defines the hierarchy of gender, white supremacy that of race, capitalism that of class, and imperialism that of nationality. Far-right belief systems are just comorbidities of isms: racism, classism, sexism, nationalism. Nationalism is interesting because it can mean supporting the political self-determination of a group of people or defining a nation by membership of a certain group. It can also mean prioritization of your national identity as one of the most important aspects of your identity, or belief in the innate superiority of your nation over that of others. You can see how the flexibility of that term allows it to encompass both like black nationalism as self-determination and a unique national identity for African Americans robbed of that by white supremacist power structures, and white nationalism trying to establish a white ethno-state by purging society of non-white people. The Alt-Right Playbook by Ian Danskin is a series of videos on YouTube that explains these concepts for the purposes of contextualizing the alt-right movement There's no blurb to read because it's not a book, so just go watch the fucking videos. They're really good. Hierarchy, the ability to abstract information into ranked subgroups on the basis of shared characteristics within a given context, is a fundamental building block of cognition. It's not a flaw or an accident. Without abstracted tools, we'd all be speaking Entish. But sometimes people prioritize the convenience of the simplicity offered by hierarchical thinking over the admittedly overwhelming complexity of the real world. Or they genuinely believe that because it provides useful conclusions, that the world is literally divided into discrete groups. This is because they're fucking stupid. Right-wing belief insists that the world is simple and can be understood in simple terms. Since it's not, and it can't, obviously, right-wing belief is inherently anti-intellectual. In order to support such a limited worldview, right-wingers have to continuously deny or explain away new information. It's a vibes-based ideological framework. It's also definitionally opposed to equality. Far-right ideology sees the distribution of power to disempowered groups as transgressions against the natural order of things that threaten the balance of society. When you hear to the oppressors, equality feels like oppression, this is what they're referring to. Oppressors invent justifications for oppression using right-wing thinking, which is why right-wing thinkers respond to calls for equality as if their rights are being threatened. Right-wing ideological opposition to equality makes it incompatible with democracy. All that in contrast with conservatism. Conservatism is things are the way they are, and that's how they're supposed to be. It's not really a framework for understanding the world, which is why conservative political platforms use phrases like traditional values, and then have very nebulous explanations for why the way things already work is actually the best possible solution to every problem. In the alt-right playbook, Ian Danskin phrased this phenomenon in the most intuitive way I think it can be stated.
Rich people believing it's good for everyone that I'm rich is the starting assumption. That's Mickey with his shirt off. And conservatism is the pile of games where they make up reasons why that might be true after the fact. It's a retcon.
I had a whole example situation written out, but you don't really need all that from me. You've seen people work their way backwards from belief to justification in real time. What's frustrating about this is, like right-wing ideology, this is a pattern of thinking. So people conditioned to think this way can be very difficult to deal with. They can often only be convinced of something by experiencing it themselves. This leads to a kind of depressingly funny result where liberals treat people like your rights end where mine begin, and conservatives treat people like your rights begin when mine end. Liberals think your right to shake your fist ends right about where someone else's face begins. Conservatives think your right to HIV treatment begins right about when them or someone they love gets infected with HIV. This isn't always the case, though. Conservative thinking offers tools for evading critical thinking and empathy, even when forced into conflict with one's own beliefs. For reference, see My Abortion is the Only Moral Abortion, or Republican Conference crashes gay dating app servers. Conservative and right-wing belief systems are ultimately get-out-of-thinking free passes. These patterns of thought are inoculatives against new information, protecting people from the responsibility of engaging with ideas that challenge their preconceptions about the world. And because conservatism aims to preserve the status quo and the society we live in, to keep it short, features notable inequalities not as fluke but by intentional systemic design, conservatism is inherently right-wing. Conservatives reliably oppose steps towards equality for marginalized groups, putting conservatism in opposition with democracy. If you find that hard to accept, let me ask you, if conservatives joined any of the efforts for liberation for any marginalized group in the past 400 years, who would they have been fighting against? That's like asking why Southern cops never stopped Klan rallies in the South. If the cops were in uniform, there'd be nobody under the sheets. If you come out of this having learned only one thing, make it that. Conservative opposition to equality is undemocratic. Conservatism harms democracy.
That's impossible! Search your feelings. You know it to be true.
Forgot to put on my fucking... with my exceptionally white forehead reflecting sun back at you for the entire video. I'm sorry about that. There, it's better, right? In the US, we have two political parties, and they hold primaries ahead of presidential elections to determine who in the party can run for president. Without winning a primary, a party won't support a candidate's campaign, and without the political and financial support of a party, it's not possible to win the presidency. The mechanics of primaries, where party insiders are given greater influence over who wins the party's nomination, think like superdelegates, or even going so far as Republicans not holding primaries at all, means that party insiders have the ultimate say over who can be the president. This is obviously inherently undemocratic, but by positioning themselves as a barrier to power through which candidates must pass in order to win an election, political parties act as gatekeepers. And as gatekeepers, they have a real and important role. Gatekeepers keep authoritarians out of power. A demagogue is someone who builds political support through appeals to the prejudices and emotions of the masses. Whether right or wrong, it doesn't require malice or deceptive behavior. Authoritarian demagoguery, which is very fun to say out loud, can be really effective in building political support by appealing to social or economic distress, and by promising to use the expansion of state authority to solve it. Not through solid economic policy, that'd be stupid. No, by blaming immigrants, drug dealers, Jews, communists, queers, elites, the well-educated, George Soros, Jews, agnostics, pagans, Satan worshippers, Sesame Street, Jews, the gay frog stealing fentanyl in high school girls' bathrooms, or whatever other weird fucking nonsense they're on about this week. And Jews. My perspective on this is a little skewed because I've only ever seen right-wing authoritarianism, having grown up in an increasingly far-right political landscape. Someone who grew up under, Stalinism might have a different perspective. In contrast with the less politically educated general population, the experienced political party insiders are more readily prepared to recognize an authoritarian and uniquely positioned to keep them out of power. They can keep them off the ballots, out of the party, keep the party platform disaligned with them, keep them politically isolated, and if all else fails, ally with political rivals to keep them out of power. Democracy runs on good faith. It's co-op. This behavior only makes sense if you see it that way. In How Democracies Die, the authors explain two reasons gatekeepers abandon their role and allow authoritarians access to power. Because they prefer the ideas of the authoritarian over those of their political rivals, or because they want their party in power and believe that once in office they can control them. Which, as far as I know, has never been the case, but that doesn't really matter, because this time it'll be different. This time, the dinosaurs won't get out of their cages. When politicians stop seeing the goal of politics as bettering the nation, and instead see the political landscape as a game for them to win, they've abandoned the spirit of democracy. They'll inevitably start attacking the principles that enable the electorate to maintain control over the elected. That includes giving an authoritarian power that they know will be used to undermine the democratic system in favor of the expansion of their authority. Authoritarianism is the tendency towards centralization of power. This is how dinosaurs escape cages and eat faces. Authoritarians convince politicians in an already weakening democracy where the electorate is losing control over the elected to abandon the good faith spirit of democracy in favor of winning. They groom their supporters into depending on emotional reasoning by appealing to a convenient, right-wing worldview, where the problems a society faces are the result of transgressions against the natural order of things that can be solved by enabling a strong authority to keep them in their place. And then once in power, they use that authority to bribe the judiciary, dissolve political opposition, dismantle institutions, revoke access to or poison education and information, and use or fabricate emergencies to justify the further expansion of their power. I hope this behavior sounds familiar to you today. Tomorrow, I hope it fucking doesn't. $80,000 was roughly the median income for Americans last year. Median is the middle numerically, not the mode, and since fewer Americans are ridiculously wealthy, that means that more than half of Americans made less than that. $80,000 is also less than 20% of 1% of 1% of 1% of the net worth of the richest person in the world. If you made $80,000 every day, saved every penny of it, and worked every day since Jesus died, you'd still need to work every day for $80,000 a day for another 13,000 years to make that amount of money. And I know what your health insurance is like. If you vote with your wallet, people with bigger wallets get more votes. If $80,000 buys you one vote, he gets north of 5 million. And more than half of Americans don't even get one. If you vote with your wallet, What does it look like when a billionaire casts their vote? I'm looking for the blurb. I read the book at the library rather than buying it. Why is America living in an age of profound and widening economic inequality? Why have even modest attempts to address climate change been defeated again and again? Why do hedge fund billionaires pay far lower tax rate than middle-class workers? In a riveting and indelible feat of reporting, Jane Mayer illuminates the history of an elite cadre of plutocrats headed by the Kochs and the Schaafs, the Olins and the Bradleys, who have bankrolled a systematic plan to fundamentally alter the American political system. Mayer traces a Byzantine trail of billions of dollars spent by the network, revealing a staggering conglomeration of think tanks, academic institutions, media groups, courthouses, and government allies that have fallen under their sphere of influence. Drawing from hundreds of exclusive interviews as well as extensive scrutiny of public records, private papers, and court proceedings, Mayer provides vivid portraits of the secretive figures behind the new American oligarchy and a searing look at the carefully concealed agendas steering the nation. Dark Money is an essential book for anyone who cares about the future of American democracy. It looks like fucking Inception. A comprehensive breakdown of the subject matter of this book is beyond my current knowledge base, so I'm gonna just get straight to the point. Charles and David Koch created a massive network of intentionally obfuscated, politically motivated organizations that function as a kind of ideological assembly line that manufactures the political climate most advantageous to them personally. No fluff, no pussyfooting around it. That's what it does. It's not a coincidence that every single idea and policy position that comes out of the network just happens to explicitly benefit the people who engineered it. That's what it was designed to do. If you believe that it really is a coincidence and that the Koch brothers and their donor network share the genuinely held belief that the ideas that they're pushing are in the best interest of the nation, you have to then acknowledge that what they think is best for the nation is virtually indistinguishable from feudalism. Also, I'm the Prince of Nigeria and I need your help. The way it functions, simplified, is a shell game of organizations that anonymize and obfuscate the sources of funding that's then distributed to different stages of the manufacture of artificial political momentum in an assembly line designed by a guy named Richard Fink. They establish what they describe as beachheads at top universities, selectively funding conservative professors and engineering ideologically libertarian-framed courses. Sometimes they also fund ideologically motivated studies with small numbers and using methods of analysis that skew results. There's a growing pseudoscience issue that's also covered in the Fingerprints of Capitalism, but that's for another time. From there, think tanks take these libertarian ideas and turn them into policy that they then push onto politicians. And finally, they fund lobbyist campaigns, PACs, ads, news coverage, and astroturfing to manifest the illusion of broad support for the implementation of that policy. That's ultimately so influential that politicians who don't accept their platform fail. All this is designed with the explicit intention of hiding itself from public awareness. Each of the nonprofits, think tanks, special interest groups, political attack ads, the university courses, and funding all describe themselves as independent. But through the investigative journalism of Jane Mayer, we only now know that all of these are connected under the explicit design of pushing anarcho-libertarianism and funded almost entirely by just a handful of people. This is the machine that manifested the Tea Party out of thin air. It pulled American politics into far-right extremism from under Obama's feet, and it made political success in the United States conditional based on allegiance with capital. It shrank the coalition and transformed our nation into an oligarchy. Now, I recognize that, like the section on right-wing and conservative ideology, since this is so far from conventional wisdom, for some people, you might be reticent to accept it. I didn't exactly take time to build a bridge between the center of American politics and this, but to be completely honest with you, this is the world I've always lived in. People my age know that the world is not designed for them, and we don't expect it to get any better. We don't have any reason to. I have never seen good faith in American politics. So, after growing up in the Obama era, after spending 20 years watching America deteriorate around me as the temperature of the political landscape raised slowly enough to boil the gay frogs without them noticing, with the contextual frameworks provided by the Dictator's Handbook, How Democracies Die, Dark Money, and the Alt-Right Playbook. From my perspective, America was designed as an ideologically right-wing, hierarchical system. The economy was dependent on the exploitation of the socially disempowered. The wealthy class established a social hierarchy based on race to separate the otherwise aligned interests of poor, white, non-landowners and the enslaved by providing them privilege in society in order to perpetuate the exploitation that their wealth was based on. As the economy grew larger and more complex, the role of the citizens in generating the wealth of the nation increased, shrinking the role of forced labor. This was the expansion of the coalition that forced the needs of the population to be met by the expansion of their rights and investment in infrastructure that supports them. The powerful, with a vested interest in maintaining the status quo because of how it privileged them, aligned with the right wing and the conservative in an attempt to slow this progress. In every example of a progressive win throughout American history hides the efforts of those groups to subvert or undercut it by altering or expanding the existing infrastructure of exploitation. When people talk about systemic racism, this is what they're referring to. You can draw an almost straight line from slave catchers to SWAT teams. Law enforcement is legally protected should they take the life of a child who commits petty theft, but left without the legal tools to address the crimes of exploitation like wage theft, because it wasn't designed to do that. In an effort to preserve the hierarchy of white supremacy in the South after the Civil War, infrastructure was invented with the explicit goal of preventing the newly emancipated population of former slaves from voting. Complex voter registration forms exploiting low literacy rates, requirements for forms of identification and documentation that slaves would obviously not have been given, like birth certificates and marriage certificates, rigged and ridiculous tests and trials, guess the number of fucking jelly beans, you get the idea. But these were all weak efforts that were ultimately never going to overcome the inescapable, explosive growth and diversification of the economy that came, growth that expanded the coalition even further. So, for a while, we had something resembling a functional democracy, admittedly long after the declared birth of the nation as an independent government. The power over the economy was well distributed across the population. Access to education, speech, and political engagement was growing rather than shrinking. Those denied political participation in the past were gaining it, and although long and hard political battles lied ahead in confrontation of the right-wing hegemonic nature of America, at the heart of the political system was a good faith battle of ideas for the betterment of the nation. And then that good faith died. McCarthyism led the Conservative Party to abandon mutual respect because inflammatory lies were more politically useful than the truth. And in the background, with the already privileged access to the political system and practically unlimited resources, a small number of ultra-wealthy individuals engineered another new form of power-concentrating infrastructure, the Koch network, that manufactured control over the political process and concentrated wealth, ultimately shrinking the coalition. This infrastructure became one of the most influential forces in American politics, making alignment with the political goals of its architects a requirement for most members of the Conservative Party, eventually forcing them to adopt obstructionism against the overwhelming public mandate of the Obama administration, killing forbearance. And with mutual toleration long dead and a deep history of hierarchical thinking embedded in society, they invented justifications for it that evoked racist sentiment and painted Obama as a threat to America. And then even more power-concentrating infrastructure was designed, this time not in policy, but in technology. Hegemonic control over news media, algorithmic bubbles, disinformation campaigns, and at the same time, with American industry increasingly moving overseas, the economic contributions of most American citizens made up a smaller portion of the economy. The coalition continues to shrink. So, America is suffering hard, and most of its suffering, frankly, is a natural result of the concentration of wealth under capitalism. There's no two ways of putting it. But with right-wing thinking so prevalent, it's being blamed on immigrants, poor people, black people, women, queers, Jews, those gay frogs, and then along comes Sprayton, who encourages fellow Republicans to abandon what little commitment they had left to even the appearance of good faith in favor of winning, who they allowed undue power because they preferred his brand of status quo protecting power concentrating ideas and under the false impression that they can control him once he gained office, who grooms his supporters into relying on emotional reasoning as he paints an appealing and convenient right-wing worldview where the economic problems America faces are the result of criminal, illegal immigrants, their transgressions of the radical left against the natural order of things, and the riotous, predominantly black, Democrat-run cities he describes using racially coded language like infestation or impure or poisoning the blood of our nation, who builds a platform off of calls to return to the way things were when America was great, who insists that all America's problems can be solved by enabling him to put those people in their place. And now that he's in power, he's been unleashed by a bribed judiciary. He's attempting to dissolve his political opposition. He's dismantled institutions. He's attacked access to education and continues to spread misinformation. He's fabricated an emergency to justify the expansion of his power by deploying the U.S. military against its citizens, provoked by violence in the neighborhoods committed by a secret police force rounding up ethnic minorities and shipping them to concentration camps or deportation. There's a word for that. There's a word for a far-right, authoritarian ultranationalist who gains power through calls to return their nation to a mythologized past greatness by purging society of its enemies and reestablishing its rightful social hierarchies. That same word is used to describe past leaders who also employed secret police forces to round up undesirables for shipment to concentration camps. Donald Trump is a fascist. The people who support him are fascists. Fascism is not stable. If we don't stop them, they will bathe the world in blood and laugh as they drown themselves in it. Complacency in the face of this magnitude of threat will get us all killed. We have a responsibility to stand between them and the people that they're trying to hurt. Everyone has the responsibility of being an active participant in the world. I just hit record.